Prime Minister Mark Carney has delivered on that promised reset of Canadian-Chinese relations. He is positioning China as a major partner as Canada moves away from dependence on the United States.
I'm pleased today to announce that Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs. This is a return to the levels that existed prior to recent trade frictions.
Breaking tonight. Canada has just made a move so quiet, so calculated, that Washington didn't even realize what it lost until it was already gone. While the United States was focused on threats, pressure, and political theater, Ottawa locked in Asia's energy future, and in doing so, rewired global power without firing a single shot. For decades, one assumption ruled North American energy. Canada could produce, but America would always control the exits. Pipelines ran south, contracts leaned U.S.-centric, and Washington believed that leverage would last forever. That assumption is now dead. What just happened is not a trade deal. It's a strategic break. Canada finalized long-term Lang supply commitments that point west, not south, toward Asia, not the United States. Volumes measured not in headlines, but in tens of millions of tons per year. Infrastructure designed not for election cycles, but for generations. And partners chosen not for proximity, but for permanence. For years, Canadian energy producers faced a simple problem. It was easier to sell oil and gas to the United States than to their own provinces, let alone overseas. Internal barriers, limited ports, and U.S. pipeline dominance kept Canada locked into one customer. That customer knew it and used it. Tariffs, threats, renegotiations, political pressure. The message was clear: Canada had nowhere else to go, so Ottawa did the unthinkable. Instead of fighting the pressure publicly, it rebuilt the system quietly. While Washington argued, Canada invested. While threats escalated, concrete was poured. While headlines focused south, steel and ports turned west. On Canada's Pacific coast, LNG capacity expanded at a scale that changes math, not just markets. Facilities capable of shipping more than 50 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually once fully online. That volume alone rivals major global exporters. And unlike spot shipments, these flows are locked into long-term contracts stretching decades into the future. Here's the part Washington missed. China didn't just agree to buy Canadian long. It took equity positions, ownership stakes, long-term supply guarantees. This wasn't fuel trading, it was infrastructure alignment. When a buyer owns part of the export chain, the relationship stops being optional. Asia's energy demand is not slowing. China's gas consumption continues to rise by billions of cubic meters every year. Japan and South Korea are racing to replace coal. Southeast Asia is industrializing fast. And Canada just placed itself directly into that growth curve, permanently. Meanwhile, the United States assumed it would always be the default customer. But pipelines don't vote. Ports don't listen to speeches. And LNG terminals don't care about political pressure once contracts are signed. This is where timing matters. As U.S. rhetoric toward allies grew harsher, capital grew cautious. Energy investors don't fear competition, they fear unpredictability. And when tariffs become bargaining chips and alliances become transactional, money looks for stability elsewhere. Canada offered that stability. Instead of retaliation, Ottawa offered reliability. Instead of escalation, it offered law, contracts, and certainty. While Washington talked about leverage, Canada eliminated it. The numbers tell the story the fastest. Tens of billions of dollars in Lang infrastructure, supply agreements spanning 20 to 30 years, shipping routes optimized for Asia, not North America. Pricing structures linked to Asian benchmarks, not U.S. hubs. Once those systems lock in, they don't reverse. You don't reroute an LNG port. You don't tear up a liquefaction plant. You don't renegotiate decades-long supply chains because politics changed. This is why the impact is so severe. Even if a future U.S. administration tried to rebuild influence, the window is gone. Canada's westward energy corridor is already committed. Asia's demand is already allocated, and America's role as gatekeeper has already expired. Ironically, this shift was accelerated by pressure meant to prevent it. When tariffs were threatened, Canada was forced to confront a weakness it had ignored for decades: internal trade barriers and overdependence on one partner. The response wasn't defiance. It was redesign. Internal barriers were dismantled, provincial coordination improved, domestic logistics accelerated, and suddenly, Canada wasn't just exporting energy, it was exporting sovereignty. This is why the story isn't about China winning. China gained supply security, yes, but Canada gained something more valuable: independence of choice. For the first time in modern history, Canadian energy strategy is no longer constrained by a single border. And the United States didn't lose because of a hostile act, it lost because it misread loyalty as inevitability. Energy power today isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who builds quietly, commits early, and locks in the future before others notice. That's exactly what Canada did. By the time Washington realized Asian-long contracts were signed, ports completed, and volumes allocated, the leverage was already gone. No sanctions could undo it, no speech could reverse it, and no pressure could bring those flows back south. This moment will be studied for years, not as a confrontation, but as a lesson. Pressure can force compliance in the short term, but it also forces preparation. And when preparation turns into infrastructure, power shifts permanently. Canada didn't announce a break from U.S. energy dominance, it simply made itself unnecessary. And that may be the most consequential move of all. What happens next will determine whether this shift becomes a temporary adjustment or a permanent realignment of global power. Energy infrastructure does not move quickly, but once it moves, it reshapes alliances for decades. Canada's westward pivot is already altering trade routes, investment flows, and diplomatic calculations far beyond North America. The question now is not whether the United States responds, but how it adapts to a world where influence is earned through stability rather than pressure. As Asian demand continues to rise and long-term contracts lock in supply, the balance of leverage continues to drift. Markets are watching, governments are recalibrating, and corporations are quietly adjusting strategies behind closed doors.